14. To the Pacific Ocean. With the fury and excitement of the two battles of Palembang behind us, a couple of days' sailing on a southerly course brought us to Fremantle, Western Australia. We had buried our dead. Now we transferred ashore our wounded, refueled, collected some mail, and, blessed event, took on board some fresh food. A pint of milk at the door every morning is the most trivial of the day's events. But when you have subsisted for months on the powdered variety, the sight of a jug of the real stuff is a matter for universal rejoicing. Throw in some fresh eggs, lettuce, vegetables, fruit and meat, and you have firmly laid at least one of the foundations of a very happy ship. We were at cruising stations one lovely morning as we plodded southwards towards Australia. Our Major of Marines, David Mahoney, and I were standing on Wings Bridge, chatting idly, looking out across the flight deck. Illustrious was back marker of the fleet. David gripped my arm. "There's a man out there, Hans. Look." As he spoke, his two fists hit the alarm buttons. One, man overboard, the other, a signal to a Marine on the quarterdeck to throw 2 lifebelts astern. There was a man, too, sliding past at 18 knots. He was 50 yards from the ship's side. His mouth was open, and one arm, with hand outstretched, was raised over his head. We rushed onto the compass platform, bursting in on the captain and OOW to break the news. Captain Lamb brought a patrol of Corsairs down from 5,000 feet to search astern of the ship, and a signal to Indomitable quickly brought a destroyer from the screen to the area behind the fleet, where the smoke from the lifebelt's flares was already marking an approximate position. They found nothing. What was more, no ship had reported man overboard. This was incredible. The flagship signalled, "Were we sure?" Yes, we were sure. More questions, more shout affirmations from David and myself. Inevitably, the fleet was ordered to clear the lower deck. Every ship mustered their crews. No one was missing. By now, destroyer and aircraft had been recalled. Again came questions from the flagship. Just how certain were we? Was there surely some mistake? Was it not gash thrown over the side that we had seen? Was the arm that we had seen not a broken spar floating in wreckage? No, it was a man. We stuck to our guns. No matter how hard we were pressed, we knew we were right. It had been a man. At 11:50 came Up Spirits, the daily issue of rum. Then and only then did the tragedy unfold. The man we had seen, the man who had died that desperately lonely death as he watched the fleet sail past him unheeding, was a Royal Marine from Indomitable. When last seen, he had been pulling through his Bofors or Ercole cannon in the port nets. He had obviously taken one step backwards too many and had fallen 50 feet to the water. His shouts had gone unheard, lost in the beating of the propellers, in the wake and the roar of the air intake fans. Poor devil. What a lonely death to die. The fortnight of light duties which followed the slight concussion I had suffered in the crash expired during the voyage round to Sydney, and I now sought my friend Bob Ellison officially, for I was anxious to fly again. We met in sickbay where he could use his paraphernalia. He tested heart, lungs, and reflexes. He examined eyes and ears. Then he said, "Mercury." The mercury test is one of the crucial items of a flyer's medical examination. The victim is confronted by a metal stand supporting a U-tube containing mercury. How much, I don't know, but during the test one gets the impression that it amounts to a hundredweight or two. You are handed a rubber tube connected to one end of the U-tube. You take a deep breath and proceed to blow. The object is to raise the mercury to a required level and there to hold it steady, with as little oscillation as possible for about 60 or 70 seconds. It's murder. It had seemed pretty bad when I had undergone the test twice in the early days, but now it was hellish. Bob looked at me. "Is that the best you can do, for Christ's sake?" "Give me another shot." This was against all the rules, and I knew it, but what are friends for? This time it was better, and by no means as good as the book said it should be. There was a moment's silence. "I suppose you really do want to fly again?" "Of course. I'm damned if I'm going to sit around watching all the other guys. And for God's sake, don't send me to sit on a bloody airfield for the rest of the war." He sighed. "Go on then, you crazy bastard." He moved to stow away all his gear. "But don't fall in again, Hans. That last effort frightened me." He grinned. "Nowhere near as much as it frightened me. And thanks for the let-off with that fornicating apparatus. You might have done better if I'd pushed the bloody tube somewhere else. Come on for a drink." As we approached Sydney Heads, we flew off our aircraft and landed at Nowra, out in the sticks of New South Wales. This was the Navy's first mobile naval air station, MONAB, designed to be picked up, packed up, and moved at the drop of a hat to God knows where. Commander Nunnally, a friendly, charming little man with an elfish glint in his eyes, was in charge. He had a mixed bag under his command, some good, some bad, but it was 1945, and the scraping of the barrel for recruits was nearing the bottom. We flew for a couple of days, then hightailed it for Sydney for a short leave. We lived aboard the ship and were faintly surprised to find her high and dry in the fine new graving dock at Woolloomooloo. Inspection of the ship had revealed that the centre propeller shaft had developed a wobble in its tunnel, caused through deterioration of the lignum vitae glands in the shaft tube, which had reached serious proportions. Time did not allow for lengthy repair work, so the propeller and its shaft were removed, and the tunnel, from which the shaft emerged to the water, was sealed most effectively by an enormous streamlined steel sheath. The biggest and toughest contraceptive in the world, as the boys named it. In Sydney, we went to one or two nightclubs and indulged in a bit of drinking. This was a bit erratic, for I don't think we ever really understood Australian licensing laws, infinitely madder than our own. So far as we could see, the pubs opened for about 2 hours between 5 and 7 p.m., during which the entire male population of Sydney erupted from its offices, banks, warehouses, or whatever, and invaded the nearest hostelry, where bloody battles ensued, the weakest going to the wall, their thirst unassuaged. Thirsts appeared to be phenomenal, and to stand in the way of an Aussie making his tank-like advance on a pint of beer was a hazardous blunder to make. All too soon we were back at Nowra. We resumed our flying practice and made the most of the modest and restricted pastimes available to us. A few of the lads even found some girls. Where from, God knows. All I could see in the district was sheep. The Nowra of those days was a drab little town in the middle of a great dusty plain, comprising one very long, very dusty main street, lined with wooden frame houses, shops and pubs. All had wooden rails on which to tie up one's horse. Very Hollywood. Johnny Hastings, who had insisted on sharing our exile out in the backwoods, organised a concert. Well, an entertainment. For the local inhabitants. I must say it went like a bomb, and we could have stayed there forever as far as they were concerned, starved as they were for live entertainment. Officers and ratings alike rallied round and put on a great show. During the singing of our sexier solos, I was gratified to see some of our sailors looking hungrily at 50-year-old farmers' wives. Apparently, even our kind of music had charms. The highest speed I ever achieved in a Corsair occurred at Nowra. I took a worn-out aircraft up to Bankstown, near Sydney, and returned with a new one. Flying the odd 80 miles back to Nowra, I saw from my watch that I would be hard put to arrive in time for lunch, and lunch in the mess was rather like the Sydney pubs. You had to be there when the "come and get it" call went out. Otherwise you missed out completely. I arrived over the field at 18,000 feet, hungry and thirsty. I dropped her into a vertical dive, took off the supercharger and let her go for Mother Earth. I was doing a hell of a speed. My circuit of the field was almost aerobatic as I put down wheels and flaps and did a quick landing. I reached the mess just in time and found myself sitting opposite Eddie Jess, leading navigator of our Avenger squadron. Eddie was a mathematician obsessed with navigational problems, vectors and courses. "Who was that coming downhill in a hurry just now, Hans?" "Me," I replied. "You were going at a hell of a lick." He fished from his pocket his small air computer. "What height did you start your dive?" I told him. "Did you happen to notice your airspeed indicator?" Yes, I had seen exactly where the needle was during the fast drop to ground level. He muttered something about air temperature and did a bit of twiddling on the computer. He whistled through his teeth. "Yes, you were moving. I reckon you were doing about 535 miles per hour. Quick, I would say." During our voyage to Sydney, I had been considerably impressed by the keenness of two of my young men, maintenance petty officers. A recent AFO had asked for volunteers from the ranks for flying training. No one yet knew of the atomic bomb, and we all thought the war against Japan would go on forever. These two boys had got wind of it and asked me to recommend them. As I say, I was impressed. Not that they were in any way unsuitable, far from it, in fact. But I would have thought that the hammering the air groups had taken at Palembang might well have made them think twice. Anyway, here they were, and I was prepared to back them to the hilt. "Has either of you flown at all?" They looked at one another. "No, sir." "Well, to begin with, are you sure you would like it? It isn't everybody's cup of tea, you know, and I would rather you didn't apply at all than volunteer and then find you hated it." I thought for a moment. I wasn't going to risk their lives with a first time off the deck in an Avenger whilst at sea. "Tell you what, when we reach Sydney, I'll find some way or other of getting you airborne. Then we will see how you feel about it." We hadn't been at Nowra a day before they reminded me of my promise. That evening I asked Nunnally if I might borrow a tiger moth on the following day to give these young men a short trip. I summoned them next morning and had them fitted out with parachutes and Gosport helmets. They were straining at the leash. Having given the first joyride to the quieter boy, by the time I returned, the other lad had worked up to a full head of steam. He almost wished the tiger off the ground, so keen was he to become airborne. I levelled at 3,000 feet, and he immediately yelled down the voice pipe, "Will you do some stunts, sir?" We certainly had a keen baby here. "What sort of stunts?" "Well, you know, sir, the lot. Will you, please?" I told him to tighten his harness. Then I threw him around for a while. Rolls, chandelles, wing-overs. No sooner was I straight and level again You haven't done a loop yet, sir. Bloody little glutton. All right, here goes. As we came out of the first one, he whooped in sheer ecstasy, so I went straight into a second. As we recovered from that, "One more, sir, please." Throttle wide open, stick forward. Now back and more right rudder. Now we're on top and the engine has cut out. Let her fall again. Cut the throttle and left rudder. The engine failed to cut in again. Height 3,000 feet. No danger. Where to put her down? The airfield was on the port side, less than a mile away. Okay. In strictly conversational tones, I said to him, "One of these days you might have to do a forced landing with no engine power. This is how you go about it." As I glided and S-turned down to the downwind end of the runway, I described every move I made. The prop, which had been gently windmilling, stopped rotating as I slowed down on my final turn to the runway. The grass and sand on either side was an unknown quality for landing, and stuck there like a bit of bloody firewood. Then I received the shock of my life. Just turning onto the downwind leg was a mob of Avengers spacing themselves out with practiced precision for their landing, and here was I, about to flop down in the middle of the one and only runway. I put the Moth onto the runway. In a flash, I was out of my cockpit, undoing the boy's harness. "Out, quick, come on, for God's sake. Now, get under that other tailplane and help me to push this bastard contraption onto the sand." You can see I still loved tigers. As we dropped the tail skid into the sand, the first Avenger swept in, touching down abreast of us. We walked away to get out of the dust and the racket. The boy looked at me uncomprehendingly. "But why didn't you taxi in, sir?" "No engine, son, no engine. It flaked out on that last loop." "So that was a real forced landing?" It was. When he had retrieved his lower jaw from the sand and had recovered his sang-froid, he became the squadron bore for a couple of days. I'm pretty certain that the squadron cooks, whose fascination with aircraft was about on par with their interest in the sayings of Confucius, were left in no doubt at all that his very first flight had culminated in his very first forced landing. I put recommendations for them through to the captain, but I doubt very much if they ever saw another cockpit. For them, at least, the war would end too soon. Michael Tritton had received as replacement for Tiddles Brown a new boy called Marriott, and one morning he asked me to take him out, mainly to run the rule over him in low flying. He was young, green, intelligent, and mad keen. But he was no low flyer as yet. Only practice would bring confidence and sure-footedness. When I took him below 30 feet, he shied like a young foal and bounced back up to 70 or 80 feet. He obviously had no affinity for Mother Earth. I took him up to 300 feet and had a quiet chat with him. Whilst 10 feet would probably see him safely home for lunch, 30 feet would undoubtedly get his head blown off. Close-range Jap gunners were hot stuff, and aircraft flying at 30 to 60 feet above the ground were easy pickings. So, let's try again. It didn't work. He had his limit, and that was that. As we buzzed along, rising and falling, as we followed the contours of the sand dunes, I tried to assure him that, provided he stayed 2 or 3 feet above my wingtip, he would come to no harm. I myself had no intention of burrowing my way through a sand dune, and if I didn't, he wouldn't. Wasted words. I cajoled, I encouraged, I swore like a leading stoker, but it was no use. He certainly wouldn't kill his chums, but his own life expectancy, particularly if he tried low flying, wasn't insurable. For the last time we were summoned to Sydney to be aboard by lunchtime. The Duke of Gloucester, Governor-General of Australia at that time, was to pay an official visit to his old friend Captain Lamb. The Duke circulated very cleverly, chatting for 6 or 7 minutes with each small group. He had just left us after a short conversation, during which we had found him to be extremely well informed on naval aviation, when one of his party joined us. For a week or two our minds had been developing the idea that, when Illustrious sailed and we would join her outside Sydney Harbour, we would fly via Sydney in one beautiful tight formation of 36 fighters, and take the whole shebang under the famous bridge. We hadn't got around to thinking about possible repercussions. We would worry about them if and when we ever returned from the Pacific. We had done a fair amount of practice, and were agreed that it would be a piece of cake. As I said, the Duke had just left us. An RAF group captain, drink in hand, strolled up to us. With no preliminaries whatsoever, he growled, "Don't you bloody do it." We looked at one another. "Don't do what, sir?" said Michael, with a pleasant smile. Groupie looked very hard. "You know bloody well what I mean. Try it, and I'll court-martial all 36 of you, and that's no idle threat." He walked away. Who had talked? Ah, well, I had been too close for comfort to a court-martial in South Africa to seek an encore, and Michael was far too sensible to fly in the face of fortune. But it would have been banner headline stuff. We sailed on March 7, and the air group landed without mishap. We had looked very longingly at Sydney Bridge. Flying was pretty limited as we drove north. During the next 6 or 7 days, we did 1 or 2 exercise strikes. Not much, certainly, but sufficient to give us the feel of the deck again. Our course took us along the line of the Great Barrier Reef to the Coral Sea, thence northwards through the Louisiade Archipelago, a myriad of small, brilliant green islands skirting New Guinea. Then we broke out into the Bismarck Sea and eventually reached Manus, chief of the Admiralty Islands, about 2 degrees south of the line. Here we rejoined the fleet, most of which had arrived on the day we had left Sydney. My God, it was hot. I took a bathing party ashore on the afternoon of our arrival. Not only was the sand unbearably hot on one's feet, but the temperature of the water was such that to swim was almost an impossibility, so completely was one's energy sapped. When I heard that the carrier, a quarter of a mile from the shore, was registering her water intake for the boilers at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, I wasn't the least bit surprised. Close to the beach, we saw our hated enemies face to face for the first time. A barbed wire stockade stood within the palm trees. Inside this were hundreds of Japanese prisoners taken presumably during the recapture of this group of islands. Whilst we stood there, the Americans were unloading more of them across the open beach. They were taking no chances with these boys either, for each Jap was securely shackled by chains, hand and foot, to ring bolts set in the decks of the small vessels transporting them. Some wore khaki shorts, most of them loincloths. Only a few had shoes or sandals. All of them looked thin, and their crew cuts only served to stress their gaunt appearance. They stood in groups, inscrutable, silent, and wholly impassive. In the centre of a long, broad beach rose a great outcrop of rock about 30 feet high and 30 feet square. A sickly, nauseating odour pervaded the whole area, and it was only when we had climbed this rocky eminence and found, running across its centre, a deep crevice in whose darkness we could just discern upturned shoes or boots, with the telltale detached big toe compartment, that we realized we had discovered the source. Japanese soldiers had fallen into the crack when shot dead, and their putrefying corpses were rendering paradise hideous with their disgusting gases. Now we were back in the tropics, fresh water had to be rationed again. The intense heat drove us to showers and refreshing drinks, and 1,800 men, thirsty for anything wet, soon overloaded the system. The two evaporators could produce 140 to 160 tons of fresh water a day, but that was insufficient when temperatures were running well over the 100 mark. Our squadron office immediately below the flight deck regularly registered 127 degrees at midday. After 3 days we sailed, heading for the Carolines, and on March 20 anchored in Ulithi, inside the Great Coral Atoll. Someone said the atoll was well over 20 miles in length, and it seemed that every inch of it was occupied by ships of one kind or another, and mainly warships, both USN and RN. A 30-knot wind blew across it night and day. What a hell of a place! I thought of boyhood reading and R.M. Ballantyne's The Coral Island. It wasn't like this at all. It was our last chance for a conference before we went into battle again. Aboard Indomitable, Vian's Chief of Staff, Captain Wright, conducted a meeting in the early part of a hot afternoon. After 1 hour precisely, the door opened and Vian came in, tall, erect, slim-figured, and with his pale blue eyes alert and quicksilver. He strode smartly to the side of his Chief of Staff. "All right, right," he said, loud and clear. "If we can't organize the thing in an hour, it's not worth doing." There was a pause as those searching eyes, surmounted by heavy eyebrows, surveyed the officers who fairly filled the wardroom. "Stand up, the flying boys." The COs of the many squadrons rose to their feet. "I've a short message. No, don't bother taking notes. It's only 4 words. For you to take back to your air crews. Get bloody stuck in. Any more questions? Right. And the best of luck to all of you." We were soon to learn that he was well worth getting bloody stuck in for. 15. Kamikaze. On March 23, the British Pacific Fleet, in all its might and majesty, sailed from Ulithi for the new theatre of war. The bureaucratic side of the Navy, which no doubt directed our destinies, but, beyond that, appeared to our lowly eyes to leave us otherwise uninvolved, had been busy. The U.S. Navy in Washington had never been over-anxious to see the Royal Navy in the Pacific Ocean. Moves and counter-moves had been made whilst we were chewing straws at Nowra, or swinging to buoys in Manus and Ulithi, and eventually the decision had been taken. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet, under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz and his deputy, Admiral Raymond Spruance, was now poised to launch Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, possession of which would give the U.S. Air Forces airfields from which to attack the mainland of Japan itself. The direction in which the energies of the British Pacific Fleet should be channeled had long been the subject of controversy, at times acrimonious, between the U.S. and British governments. On March 14, however, the diplomatic skies cleared at last, and the British Pacific Fleet received a signal directing it to report for duty to Admiral Nimitz. So the fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Sir H.B. Rawlings, now became Task Force 57, to work alongside the Americans' fast carrier force, Admiral Mitscher, both under the direct command of Admiral Spruance. This officer ordained that the neutralization of the 3 islands of the Sakishima Gunto, Miyako, Ishigaki, and Iriomote should be our responsibility. Their importance in the coming battle lay in the fact that all 3 possessed airfields. When the fury of the U.S. fleet's air attacks fell upon Okinawa, the enemy's hopes of replenishing their supply of aircraft would lie only in staging them from China, through Formosa and the Sakishima Islands group. It was hoped that our operations would render this impossible, or at the least, extremely hazardous and uncertain. The Fleet Air Arm was now to embark upon a war of attrition, in which, like all toe-to-toe slogging matches, there was to be neither glamour nor spectacle. It was to be sheer drudgery, with a heavy price to be paid for a result which would never be assessed with even a moderate degree of accuracy. The passage of 30 years has blunted for me many of the details of our part in that seemingly endless battle. Of the 4 carriers which took the flight to the enemy that day, Illustrious was the weary one, for we had endured life in the tropics longer than most, and strain and tiredness were now to be seen in the faces of the air crews. We were becoming worn and twitchy. To seek an early night's sleep just didn't seem to work. One flew round the cabin, dodging the flak, practicing a landing for the first 2 hours, and if sleep eventually came, only 3 hours or so of fitful rest remained before a shake from the duty boy brought one reluctantly to the dark, cold beginning of another day. Breakfast had always been a cheering time with plenty of wisecracking and laughter. Now it was a silent feast of too little food and too many cups of coffee and cigarettes, and a significant absence of chatter. The losses and prangs we suffered now had a telling effect. Where our pilots in earlier days had produced resilience and courage, which seemed automatic, to recover quickly from their own accidents, or crashes, or death involving their friends, the losses were now hard to bear, and brought dejection and fretfulness. Their natural ebullience retreated and left them thoughtful and introspective. Tiredness brought lethargy and carelessness to their flying. Some of the landing approaches and landings themselves were hideous to behold, and to watch them was a nightmare few could endure for more than a few minutes at a time. Yet through it all, youth and the rich instinct born of sound training could still find a crack to burst through, to express themselves in a bright flash of repartee and fun. And every day produced a fresh crop of incidents which, tragic or dangerous though some of them might be, at least sent the adrenaline pumping through, strongly and excitedly, and restored the boys, even briefly, to their old excellence and brilliance. Despite the tiredness, Operation Iceberg brought out some of the best in us, even though the life we now led was something which, like a penetrating fluid, searched out, exposed, and exploited that tiredness. The captain-commander flying and the navigator rarely left the island during the whole operation. The day's work began at 03:30, when air crews, squadron ratings and flight deck parties were roused. Between 04:30 and 0500, the ship closed up to action stations in readiness for suicide attacks, for we were now in kamikaze territory. All guns' crews closed up. All watertight doors were secured, which meant that for most of the officers their cabins were barred to them. The ventilating fans were shut down, causing the inside of the ship to become airless and, as the day wore on, decidedly smelly. Food consisted of bully beef sandwiches and endless tea. typical action stations rations. So we were thrown out of our cabins, usually at the last moment, and, if you were unwise enough to snatch those last few precious minutes, unwashed and unshaven. Some chaps in a fine, "oh, sod it" spirit shunned ablutions, even breakfast, and flew all day in their pyjamas against the empire of the rising sun. Most of us went along for some sort of breakfast. Those on the early shift, so to speak, then made their way to the air operations room, some to remain there on standby, the remainder to grab their helmets and Mae Wests, and go out to the flight deck in the cold of a pre-dawn morning to climb into their Corsairs and sit and shiver. In the meantime, Colin Cunningham and John Hastings were checking and spotting the aircraft for takeoff, most of which duty had been carried out the previous evening. At 0600, the first standing patrols took off, followed quickly by the first mixed striking force of the day. The Avengers to bomb the runways on the 3 islands, the fighters to shoot up any aircraft they could find and stand guard over the bombers. With the first launch out of the way, more Corsairs were ranged at readiness to be scrambled immediately should the enemy appear on the radar screens. As soon as the early strike was seen to be returning, Corsairs flew off to continue the patrols over the islands. This was usually a 3-hour stint, with the patrols being replaced at regular intervals until darkness fell. The ship remained at a state of readiness throughout the day, conditioned by 3 stages of air raid warnings, yellow, blue, and red, which demanded, for the fighters, standby, readiness, and scramble in that order. So the day wore on. Takeoffs and landings at regular intervals, requiring the fleet to turn into wind on each occasion. And how the destroyers loved this. It provided for them a refreshing change from their faithful zigzagging and ASDIC watch, which they pursued zealously and endlessly. For suddenly they were required to reform their screen as quickly as possible, which gave them the chance to show their paces by romping through the fleet at a rate of knots, with no end of panache and exhibitionism. In the late afternoon, a strike of Avengers took off for one more attack on the airfields, to pound once again all the landing strips just before darkness fell. This made it difficult for the Japs to do any repairs to them that day, thus rendering it hazardous for night landings to be made by aircraft hopeful of staging through from Formosa to Okinawa. On morning patrols we often saw crashed aircraft which had fallen foul of some crater, obviously having attempted to do just that. At dusk, when all our aircraft had returned, they were serviced, refueled, and rearmed against the next day's operations. Those which were unserviceable were set upon by the weary fitters and riggers, who would work all the night through, if needs be, to get them back into fighting trim. We were, of course, still burdened with our deck park of 14 aircraft, which could be neither refueled nor rearmed until the next morning. In that condition, they could not possibly be set on fire by a night suicide attack. When the COs of the squadrons and their maintenance chiefs had finalized their Mayfly lists, aircraft serviceable to fly on the morrow, the first takeoff of the day was decided upon. Then the hangar parties set to work, ranging the allotted aircraft onto the lifts and up to the flight deck, where the deck parties would spot the Avengers and Corsairs in the correct positions for the next morning's takeoff. This chore could keep these grand chaps hard at work until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Blessed relief from action stations came with nightfall. Cabins were once again accessible, and one could indulge in a shower and a change of clothing from the everlasting flying overalls, grimy and dank with perspiration. Full ventilation was resumed, and at long last a substantial meal was available. A quick beer, then off to bed. These were no nights for sing-songs. For 3 days on end this was our existence. Late on the third afternoon the fleet turned away from the operational area and, after a hard night's steaming, rendezvoused next morning with the fleet train. A great supply fleet with its main base in Sydney and a forward one at Manus. For 40 hours we cruised together at low speed. Tankers were there to top up every ship. Aviation spirit tankers brought the lifeblood for the aircraft. Escort carriers were there with replacement aircraft and pilots, and for all of us, ammunition and supply ships with everything else we required, especially food and mail. As far as possible, the fleet relaxed and rested. Frigates and sloops of the fleet train maintained anti-submarine patrols. Fighters from the escort carriers patrolled all the hours of daylight over the vast conglomeration of ships. On the evening of the second day we parted company. Again we steamed hard for the iceberg area, and by dawn we were once more fit and ready for the fray, for another 3-day routine. This was the pattern of all our lives. Our battles with the enemy on the Sakashima Gunto started on March 26, and for the first time we fell upon the airfields of Miyako, Ishigaki, and Iriomote. The old firm of Illustrious and the Victorious suffered disaster almost immediately. One of our Avengers was shot down, with the loss of the 3 crewmen, and Vic's Chris Tompkinson, CO of 1836 Corsair Squadron, failed to return from the islands. Flak was the great leveller. It could send to a sudden, flashing death the experienced and the sprog alike, and Chris was regarded as a good, safe hand, a great pilot with many, many hours under his belt. My logbook tells me that my flight was over Ishigaki next morning, where we destroyed a twin-engined aircraft. It also says that we were lucky enough to get in and out with a minimum of fuss. That type was what we all hoped to find. In the first attack of the following day, our new Avenger CO, Freddie Nottingham, from Johannesburg, was hit over the runway at Hirara, on the island of Miyako, setting on fire the starboard wing. He promptly dropped his bombs, turned in a flash, and dived steeply out to sea, successfully extinguishing the fire. However, he had little or no time to congratulate himself on his success, for, without the slightest warning, the starboard wing broke off at the roots, and the Avenger, at no more than 2,000 to 3,000 feet, spiraled towards the sea. Freddie yelled to his crew to bail out, waited for a few seconds, then hit the silk himself. He landed safely in the water and was aboard his dinghy in quick time, but the escape-in-a-hurry exit of the Avenger was not very easy, particularly when the aircraft was falling at one hell of an angle, and his navigator and air gunner died with the aircraft. Nottingham saw them die and resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him. An Avenger from Indomitable, on his way back from the same island, saw the dinghy and circled low, transmitting a continuous Mayday signal. No one acknowledged his call, nor did anyone turn up to relieve him. Inevitably, running short of fuel, he had to leave the scene. What with landing on, debriefing, and all the excitement that fairly bubbles over after an operational sortie, it wasn't until sometime after 1100 that he remembered the dinghy. He rushed to his commander, operations, and reported it. Despite the fact that the fleet was now heading south, away from Sakashima, and towards the rendezvous with the fleet train, Admiral Vian, ready as always to pull out all the stops to rescue one of his flyers, detached a destroyer to go back to search the estimated area. Not long afterwards, an American air-sea rescue submarine, Kingfish, came up on the Admiral's wavelength. She had heard something of the exchange of signals. She wasn't too far from the reported position. Could she do anything to assist? She was given such information as was available, scanty enough, and thanked for her assistance. Around 13:30, the flagship signalled us to say that the submarine had been on the air again. According to her reckoning, the dinghy must be somewhere 9 or 10 miles south of Miyako. As she had to search on the surface, she would need fighter cover. It was our man in the drink, said the Admiral's staff, so it was from Illustrious that the fighters should be dispatched. At 1400 my flight took off and headed back towards Miyako. We hadn't gone far before I saw the destroyer which had been sent back. She was far away on my port side and on an entirely different course. I had checked mine with Ian Steele, our navigator, and Ian was never wrong. Was Undine, for that was the destroyer commanded by Commander T.C. Robinson, DSC-RN, as I was to discover later, wrong? I rang her up and suggested she might be. Not surprisingly, her reply was a bit terse. After all, the navigational capability of fighter pilots was as huge a joke to the fleet as their ability to interpret the flashings of a signalling lamp. In measured, polite terms, she said she would go her own way, thank you. The destroyer never came within miles of Freddie, but she did nearly run down another dinghy. When they had rescued the inmate, they found him to be an American fighter pilot who had been shot down off Okinawa some 40 to 50 miles further north, 2 or 3 days before. How lucky can you be? Yet I was the one who was wrong, and Undine right, for I had sadly misjudged her. Too late to be apologetic about it, I found later that there had been no cause to question her course, for she was on her way to pick up Doc Stewart, Indomitable's bomber wing leader, and his crew, who had also had the misfortune to ditch that morning. But I hadn't been told that a double rescue was afoot, and I have never been clever enough to refrain from interfering in other people's affairs. Hours were to elapse before Freddie Nottingham was found. My thoughts were interrupted by an RT call, so strong it nearly blew my helmet off. It was the Kingfish, to tell me that she was over to port from me, and when I scanned carefully from 10,000 feet, there was her wake, 5 or 6 miles away. She was on the surface and going like a bomb. A big job, too. And she looked great. As we went up to her to have a chat, the clouds were gathering over the Gunto, and I didn't see much danger of an attack. My own estimate, with which she agreed, was that we were still some considerable distance west of the probable position, and I said that we would fly searches ahead of her, a section at a time. Numbers 3 and 4 led off, while number 2 and myself remained around 7,000 feet, to give us room for manoeuvre in the event of some Jap trying his hand. The boys came back in 20 minutes. No joy. So Jimmy and I set out. Now we had to drop down, for dinghies are difficult to find from the air. It's even harder if you're looking for a head surrounded by a Mae West collar, and we had no guarantee that Freddie was still in his dinghy. We were scudding along at 50 feet, engaged in what I hoped was a fair imitation of a square search, something at which navigators are expert, but which to a fighter pilot is a closed book. Anyway, we roamed the empty seas for half an hour without success. We toiled on through the long afternoon, running on a very lean mixture and coarse pitch to give us maximum endurance. We had long since exhausted our belly tanks. The submarine and I kept up a commentary until, about 16:30, we decided we were well inside the area. Still nothing showed up, and still we went on searching. The submarine was now engaged in some search pattern of her own, and we were combing a pretty big area around her. Around 1745, I started to have dreams of home. I hadn't the faintest idea where the fleet would be, other than that they were somewhere to the south. As to how many miles away, I couldn't even begin to guess, and it would be dark by 1900 to 1930. I didn't fancy a night landing for some of the new boys, or for myself. Corsairs could kill us quite effortlessly in broad daylight, without any assistance from the darkness. So at 1800, I called up my American friend and told him I thought we should be heading south. A pity, he said, for he felt we were so near. Could I possibly stretch it to 1815? I looked around at my pilots, who were listening, of course, thinking of their lives, and realizing that they would automatically leave the whole thing to me. And then I thought of Freddie Nottingham, out there on the darkening sea. "Okay, 15 minutes. There's little danger of any interference now, so we'll send out 3 and I'll keep guard myself. Out." The boys tore off again into the gloom to the east. They were scarcely out of sight before I saw a red star rise from the water down to the south. The submarine saw it at the same time, and her wake described a great arc of silver as she put her wheel hard a starboard. I recalled the other pilots and, diving down to water level, flew past the dinghy at 10 feet. Freddie was waving his little flag like a madman. Great stuff. We waited until the submarine came down to him, 2 ratings in swimming trunks already out on the outer casing. As she hove to, with a frenzied flurry in her wake, they jumped, tied to the ends of lifelines, to help Nottingham onto the casing. After a minute or 2, the commander came on the air. "The pilot's name is Nottingham. I repeat, Nottingham." I can't remember now what I said. There was a burst of mutual thanking and metaphorical backslapping. We wished each other Godspeed and went on our ways. It must be said here that Nottingham had shown himself to be extremely cool and remarkably courageous. He had only 3 small rockets in his Mae West, little more than Roman candles, and although he had watched us for more than a couple of hours searching to the north of him, he had withstood the temptation to fire them, knowing full well that we would be unlikely to see them whilst the light remained good. Only when dusk fell did he let go the first one, and we saw it. Freddie the Unflappable. Now the rescue was achieved, it was home, James. We roared off to the south, climbing like dingbats for altitude in order to establish radio contact. We were up to 16,000 feet before I got a reply. Then Indomitable, with the best radio in the fleet, came up loud and clear. She told me not to waste time giving her a fix, just to press on and await their call when we approached on radar. Sometime later, the FDO was back. "Now we've got you. 80 miles to go. Turn 10 degrees to port onto 175 degrees. Over." I thanked him. I was a lot happier now and could almost hear the boys whistling with good cheer. We were still up in the mellow light of an orange-setting sun, with the sea far below us as black as ink. The minutes ticked away. 25 to go. Time passed. "We're down on your port side now. Can you see us? Over." I looked down at an angle of some 45 degrees. Nothing. Not yet. Over. Good God, man, you're looking down the bloody chimney. Look again. Over. Yes, they were there. When I had lost some altitude and done a couple of circuits to accustom myself to the comparative darkness, I now saw the faint white smudges, which only delicately relieved the leaden gloom of the sea. We did the rounds of the carriers to find Illustrious, putting on navigation lights for the benefit of Colin Cunningham, who was doing the batting. In fact, by the time we had flown our pattern, we could see reasonably well, and landing was no problem. Nottingham was taken by his submarine to Saipan, and in the course of a day or two, Admiral Nimitz, USN C&C Pacific, had him flown to Leyte in the Philippines in his personal aircraft. The suicide bombers came at us out of Formosa. Despite their fanatical courage and determination, the battle was by no means one-sided. On April 1st, Victorious was attacked by one whose approach was spectacular, even if the end result was disappointing for him. This son of the divine wind passed over Vic at a considerable altitude, did a half-roll, and then pulled into a vertical dive. Captain Denny judged matters to a nicety. When the Jap was fully committed to his dive, with his ailerons good and frozen, he gave helm order to port, and the horrible little man plunged into the Pacific only yards from the starboard bow. Earlier in the day, 2 kamikazes had been more successful. At first light, as we were out on the flight deck supervising the first takeoff, there was the scream of a diving aircraft passing over us. The hell of a bang followed as a suicider slammed into Indefatigable, sailing parallel to us about 300 yards on our starboard side. She took the blow in the worst possible place, in the angle between flight deck and island, and casualties in dead, wounded, and missing were heavy. The armour-plated deck protected the hangar from damage, but itself suffered a severe dent from the sheer impact. Ingenuity, however, is only one of the many arts of which a Royal Naval ship is mistress. Quick-drying cement was poured into the depression and levelled off. Within a few short hours, Indefat was operating her aircraft as though she had experienced nothing more than a slight hiccup. Ulster, one of our fine destroyers, took a kamikaze on the same day, with tragic results. This little man must have heard about armoured decks on carriers, and had decided to take on easier meat. He came steep and fast from the port beam and drove his aircraft, or his bomb, I never knew which, through Ulster's iron deck into the port boiler room. Above the gaping hole leading into the inferno below sat a Bofors gunner, who must have been a cool customer, for within seconds of the explosion he shot down a second kamikaze, which was following the first. Poor Ulster. She was stopped in her tracks, sorely stricken, but by no means lost. Gambia took her in tow and evacuated her safely from the danger area. The days passed. Patrol after patrol, sometimes morning, sometimes afternoon or evening, often all three. We became tired. We lost appetites. There was no time for laundry to be done, and our flying overalls became sweat-sodden and dirty. They were long, long flying days, punctuated by brief, flashing moments of excitement, fear, and heart-stopping flap. The enemy had a seemingly endless supply of flak ammunition, and the more aircraft we flew over his islands, the better his practice became. We drove ourselves to attack him through all the hours of daylight, and he never failed to greet us with his withering fire of deceptively slow-climbing balls of red and green, as the flak rose to bracket us. Apart from the ever-present menace of the enemy, we occasionally manufactured a few problems for ourselves. As we flew our landing pattern one afternoon, a panic call about kamikazes in the vicinity of the fleet alerted us. Right on its heels came an order to get the hell out of it and to give full bore to an interception course. I tucked up wheels and flaps, gave it the gun, and went into a fast climb to the west, at the same time turning on my gun switches, 6 of them with a master switch situated immediately below the windscreen. We must have been about 8,000 feet when the recall came. Some Charlie had approached the fleet not showing his IFF. Coming into land for the second time, I was clueless enough to forget to flick off the gun switches. Having taxied up to the forward round down, switched off the engine and unharnessed myself, I heaved myself up to get out of the cockpit, pulling on the joystick with my right hand for a bit of assistance. My 6 guns roared out with a fine, uninhibited 2-second burst. A destroyer keeping station on us 2 cables ahead promptly turned up the taps and proceeded to belt off at high speed in the general direction of Australia. I didn't blame her for one moment. A seemingly endless succession of chunks of armour-piercing steel, half an inch in diameter and about 2 inches long, scudding smartly above one's head, is sufficient encouragement to push off for any destination, even Australia. I walked down the flight deck wearing as nonchalant an expression as I could muster, but I couldn't fool Captain Lamb. As I passed close beneath the flying bridge, trying to avoid attention, I heard, "Hans?" in unusually soft tones. I looked up. His face bore the suspicion of a grin, and his right index finger beckoned me. He listened to my feeble excuse without interruption. Then, "I'm sure it's easily done, Hans. Probably too easily on a day like this has been. But you know, you shouldn't really frighten people like that." I knew, as he did, that I could easily have killed some of our side. But he knew that I knew, and he was great enough to resist delivering clichés. One evening, a young new pilot came into my cabin. He was just out from England and had come up with the fleet train. I had a chat with him and tried to make him feel at home. A pleasant kid, cheerful and as keen as mustard. As he turned to go, he hesitated for a moment and said, "Did you say your name was Hanson, sir?" I nodded. "Did you by any chance go to Pensacola, sir?" "Yes, I had trained there." "Do you know they're still talking about you?" "Well," I said, "that's very nice of them. As a matter of fact, I played the organ there for about 6 months and thoroughly enjoyed myself." "Oh, I didn't know about that. No, it's about the decompression chamber there. The surgeon commander told us to be human, or natural, I can't remember which, but certainly not to behave like another limey called Hanson, who had done the job with maximum marks, the only one ever." "Was that you, sir?" He grinned. "He doesn't seem to have got over it." "It's true for what it's worth, but I'm a bit surprised he still talks about it. If he's still there, and from what you say there's a fair chance that he is, I would have thought he would have learnt to do it himself. Anyway, the hell with history. Come on for a drink, and I'll introduce you to the boys. You'll be flying in my flight." I have said that our long spell in the tropics was now beginning to take its toll. Victorious, our chummy ship, was much fresher. Where some months earlier we had been able to beat them decisively to the draw where launching and landing were concerned, they now had the edge on us. In an endeavour to show Vic that we were still a force to be reckoned with, wings launched us one day a little prematurely, before the ship was fully turned into the wind. Illustrious was still wheeling quickly into wind with starboard helm when I rolled up the deck. As I passed the island and became exposed to the full force of the breeze blowing from the starboard side, it caught me completely unawares and carried me fiercely to port. The port wheel mounted the forward 4.5-inch turret. There was a big bang, and I almost half rolled into the sea. The bang, I discovered later, was the impact of my port flaps on a stout metal stanchion standing about 3 feet high at the very corner of the deck. With the stick hard over to starboard, a lot of praying, sheer willpower, and one hell of a lot of luck, I scraped the Corsair off the water, leaving a wake like that of a motorboat, and struggled into the air. I was relieved when, having reached sufficient height to retract the undercarriage and flaps, I found that she flew perfectly well. For 3 solid hours, off and on, I worried about the landing to come. Half an hour before we were due to land on, I handed over command of the flight to Johnny Baker and pushed off to a large cumulus cloud which was sailing serenely on its way to Hawaii. Using it as a flight deck, I made my approach. Wheels down. Okay, flaps down. Frightening. Again the aircraft rolled off to port. I looked down at the flaps as best I could. The inboard section was just below halfway down. The outward section was only very slightly down, with only partial lift on that side. The lift on the starboard side was too strong. So I went round again, this time using only half flap. The effect was not so nearly so scaring, but my landing speed had to be much higher. I put on full throttle to test the effect in case I had to take a wave off. I went into an awkward half-sideways roll that was violent enough to shake me rigid. Just before we started the descent from 10,000 feet, I called Baker over. "Johnny, I've got a problem. Come underneath me, stick your head in the wheel well, and tell me what the hell has gone." He came close beneath me. There weren't many pilots I would have allowed to come as close to me as that. After 30 seconds, he emerged and came alongside. "Is the undercarriage damaged, Johnny? I know the flaps are buggered." "Undercart okay. The jack on the port flaps is broken, and you are losing all your fluid. The metal of the flaps is badly torn. Clumsy sod, aren't you, sir?" Big grin from the cockpit. "But your undercart is definitely okay. Tires look fine too. No sign of a burst." As we dropped down to the ship, I called Johnny Hastings to the FDO's radio. I told him I had problems, and had been trying some ADDLs on one of the local clouds. I would have to land fairly fast and straight. No screaming turn, for I couldn't take a wave off. It would have to be a first-time effort. While the other boys were landing on, the ship came on the RT again. The captain gave me 3 alternatives: a landing, a bailout, or ditch, and I had to make up my mind quickly. I didn't hesitate. I would go for the landing. When the other aircraft were safely out of harm's way, the fire hoses were run out on deck, and I could see the firefighters donning their asbestos suits. I gulped once or twice. It was a daunting moment. Then, "Right, come on in." I went into my landing pattern. On the last turn towards the ship, I tentatively tried the flaps. Still that tendency to roll out of my hands, and my stall warning light flickered ominously. I'd gone in on this corner before, and I wasn't keen to do an encore. I put on a bit more urge, 88 knots, and kept it there. As I approached from something like 15 degrees from the fore and aft line, Johnny gave me, "You're fast." Sod that, I thought. You'll just have to like it, John. He brought me down, 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 still saying I was fast. Then he cut me, and with still a lot of right stick, I chopped the throttle. Christ, the wires were flying beneath me. A dirty great barrier looms up in front. So this is what it's like. Then my head was practically jerked from my neck. I had caught the last wire, for the very best of reasons, known as the Jesus Christ. Over the tannoy I heard Wing say something at once friendly and pleasantly vulgar. Home again in one piece. 2 sections of flap and a new jack were replaced within a couple of hours. Certainly a damn sight faster than I recovered. The appearance on the radar screens of suicide aircraft galvanized the whole fleet into activity. Airborne fighters were vectored towards incoming enemy aircraft, and fighters at readiness were launched. Very good interceptions were made as far as 20 to 30 miles from the fleet. Invariably, the enemy chose weather which was partially overcast. They were expert at cloud dodging, an art which occasionally reduced the serious business of war to a game of cowboys and Indians. There was one morning when 2 of our fighters caught a Jap on the hop, far, far away from the fleet, who elected to seek safety inside a large cumulus, and above and below it, and awaited developments. The impatient Churchill, however, dashed into the cloud, and in no time at all emerged on the far side, there to see his enemy only a matter of yards away from him. The Jap was quickly dispatched. Other moments, too, were reminiscent of Laurel and Hardy. Mike Tritton and I were on standby one sultry afternoon when a red warning came up. We hurtled down the ladder and out onto the after-flight deck, where we leapt into the first 2 Corsairs we reached. Other pilots were running behind us to clear the deck of aircraft. Mike took off very quickly indeed, closely followed by me. My choice didn't sound very happy. She was running very roughly, and only just staggered off the deck. This was going to be a great flight. I could hear Mike being vectored towards the enemy as I pulled up the undercarriage and went into a tight turn to form up on him. As I put on the power, however, nothing happened, apart from the hell of a lot of banging up front. It sounded as though the engine was about to leave its bearers. As Michael faded rapidly into the distance, I abandoned all hope of becoming an effective part of the defence and turned for the carrier, yelling at her as I did so to keep her into wind. I couldn't see this old cattle truck staying airborne for much longer, and I wanted an emergency landing, badly. As I jumped to the deck after parking up forward, Wolf Madison, our squadron maintenance chief, a wizard with aero engines if ever there was one, was waiting for me. He looked a bit sorrowful. "You shouldn't have taken that one, you know, sir," he said in the manner of a kindly though somewhat morose farmer delivering a homily to a schoolboy caught in the act of stealing apples. "She's waiting for a plug change and isn't fit to fly." He scratched his ear and surveyed the deck with the look of a man who had been indulging in some heart-searching. "It's been a bloody awful afternoon altogether, really. I tested the engine of this thing right after dinner, and we still haven't been able to use the lift gear to get her below. That's why she's still here." I stared at him open-mouthed. "Can't understand what you're bitching at, Chief. I can tell you she isn't safe. Not even to go shopping with. But if you will leave your rubbish lying around the deck, I didn't know she was unserviceable when I jumped into her." You want to be more careful in these dangerous times, Wolf. You might have been shot off in the thing yourself. At least you could have done the plug change while you were at it. When the Japs came within range of the fleet's guns, the atmosphere was like a Wembley Cup final, with goofers on all sides urging the gunners to get the bastards for Christ's sake. No one was under any delusion. Once a suicide attacker penetrated the patrols and reached a position 5 or 6 miles from the fleet, there was only one end. He was coming in. Nothing, apart from being blown apart, would stop him now. The toiling crews of the 4.5-inch guns were execrated in appalling language when their shells burst wide of the mark. If the screaming Zeke were shot out of the sky, the cheering was ecstatic. A goal in any man's language. We had tragedies. 2 Seafires from Indefatigable, hell-bent on finishing off their prey, followed Zeke's out into the fleet's field of fire and paid the awful penalty. It was psychologically difficult to break off when you had him cold in your sights. In an endeavour to avoid such unnecessary loss of life, orders were issued that aircraft returning to the fleet while it was still trigger-happy, following an attack, and who shall blame them for being so, should approach sedately in regular formation and with undercarriages lowered. One afternoon our flight returned in copybook formation, wheels down, as though flying past Buckingham Palace on a Sunday afternoon, when we were greeted with a salvo from Howe's secondary armament of 5.25-inch guns. A fine welcome indeed. My language over the RT was blistering and obscene. However, I was greatly mollified, first by the fact that their practice was poor and missed us by the length of Piccadilly, and even more so when I received an immediate apology, couched in much more gentlemanly and decorous terms. The manners of the Dartmouth boys, even under heavy stress, were impeccable. The flying was fast and furious. 2 or 3 days later, whilst patrolling over the fleet, we were given a vector to intercept, which spoke volumes for the efficiency of the radar operators and fighter direction team, for we must have been 20 miles away when we saw them. 4 Zeeks in straggling formation heading straight for us, and about 1,000 feet above. As we sounded the tally-ho, they broke formation and scattered to the 4 winds. 2 of them, for some reason or other, headed south, and I heard later that they had been intercepted and shot down by some of the Vic's Corsairs. The other 2 turned 180 degrees and opened up the taps for home. We gave chase, but they had at least a couple of miles head start, and even with our superior speed it would take some time to overhaul them. I bent the throttle lever and prayed that we would catch them before we had to land at Peking to refuel. Suddenly Jerry Salmon came up. Jerry was one of Michael's boys. We were flying a mixed flight on that trip. "Can we use the water injection, boss?" Good God, of course. The machine I was flying, not my own, which was being serviced, was not equipped with water injection, and the idea had never entered my thick head. "Yes, Jerry, bang it in and go get 'em." The 3 aircraft shot away from me as though I was going astern. I throttled back a little to ease my panting engine and watched the fun and games up ahead. Both enemy aircraft were quickly shot down. By now we were enlarging our capabilities by attacking the enemy in the fighter-bomber role. Since the Japanese had been obliged to concentrate on suicide tactics, interference by interceptor fighters was non-existent, and we could afford to increase our attacking tactics. The Corsair could carry quite comfortably 2 500-pound bombs, attached to racks fitted to the centre section of the wings, and with these we helped the Avengers to devastate the runways. We also used napalm bombs, which were frighteningly effective on airfield buildings and barrack blocks. Napalm cartridges inserted into our overload belly tanks were actuated from the cockpit a few minutes before dropping on the targets, and the instantaneous carpet of fire which enveloped a large area as soon as the tank hit the earth was almost sickening to see from the air. A truly dreadful weapon. Our accuracy with the conventional bombs probably wasn't as professional as that of our Avenger friends, but if you can't hit a runway, there's something seriously amiss with your eyesight. Tiredness, probably the greatest enemy with which we had to contend, was now showing itself quite blatantly. Bruce McLaren made a desperate attempt to land which was nothing less than a dive-bombing attack on the deck. Everything about it was wrong. He was too fast, too high, and his approach had been diabolical. He thumped into the deck with his main wheels, bounced clean over both barriers, and tried to stuff his nose down into the foredeck. Had he succeeded, he would have destroyed himself and 5 or 6 aircraft parked below the bows. Fortunately for all of us, his starboard wing clipped the boom of the mobile crane parked forward of the island, which slewed him round to starboard and shot him into the sea. He had the good sense to wait until he hit the water before releasing himself from the cockpit, and he was safely picked up by a destroyer. Certainly, he never flew from the carrier again. Where deck landing was concerned, Bruce had reached the pitch where Bob Ellison had to put his foot down. That immaculate flyer Percy Cole was also tiring. In the course of 3 or 4 days, he endured 2 very bad barrier crashes, from both of which he was lucky to escape unhurt. In one of them, certainly, he admitted that he had forgotten to close the throttle. Jimmy James, my RN lieutenant, stalled in the middle of his downwind leg run to the carrier. There was no good reason why he should have done so. His lack of attention resulting from tiredness allowed his aircraft to fall below flying speed. He crashed into the sea from 500 feet and escaped with a broken arm. Most of us began to suffer from off days, dreadful mornings when our normal, relaxed attitude to flying was nowhere to be seen, days when the very thought of making low-flying attacks was positive anathema. I recall one morning when we were flying the first patrol of the day over Ishigaki, whose short-range flak was by now notorious for its deadly accuracy. From 10,000 feet, scanning the airfield through my binoculars, I saw 3 aircraft, or dummies. Even with an excellent pair of glasses, it wasn't always possible to distinguish between them. 2 were in revetments, the other on the grass 50 yards from the strip. Small boards with a bulldog clip holding plans of the airfields were strapped to our thighs, and I duly penciled in the planes in their correct positions. When we landed much later, I went to see the I.O. and handed him the chart. 3 there for you, my old cock sparrow. You can put the bombers onto them. He obviously hadn't heard or noticed the last sentence. He was busily writing up his cumulative report. Hans, 3 aircraft, Ishigaki. He looked up at me. Destroyed? Not even scratched. As I said, put the bombers onto them. He stroked his chin with his pencil. But you had a go, surely. Look, I said impatiently, I don't have to explain to you what I did or why I did it. All I have to tell you is what I saw. But why not, Hans? Balls to explanations. I've given you the dope. Now it's all yours. I felt touchy and irritable, annoyed with myself for my gloomy premonitions and irritated by his persistence. 2 days later we were over the same field. Today was different. I was different. My Corsair was once again a part of me, not just a machine I was driving across the sky. I could have put her through the eye of a needle. My binoculars showed me what could be a juicy myrtle at the end of the runway. We came down from 10,000 feet and did a fast run across the field at about 5,000 feet. This was no dummy, for there was quite a gaggle of Japs buzzing about her. As we disappeared out to sea, I sized up the situation and turned to Baker. On a job like this, he was invaluable, intelligent and courageous. "You saw her, Johnny?" He nodded. "Trouble is, the guns are right behind her. I want you to do a dummy attack from the east when I tell you. Make it look really good." He knew what I wanted. He didn't even reply. When he had heard me out, he gave me the 0 sign with finger and thumb. I wheeled away from them and climbed out to the west. When I had got myself organized, I went on the RT again. "Tell me when you're all set, John. Start from about 3 miles out." "Okay, wait." Seconds passed. "All set. Say when." I lined myself up on the runway from way out and took the compass bearing. "Now, go!" I rocketed down from 10,000 feet, tearing a great strip down the sky. As I crossed the coast, I was low down, cracking along at 300 knots. I knew exactly where the Myrtle was. I was lined up on her, well out of range, when I saw Johnny and his boys steaming down in a great fast arc, drawing, it seemed to me, all the flak north of the equator. Then I was there. I opened up at long range and saw Tracer going straight into the Myrtle. There were ladders up against the engines. They were putting new props on her. She must have nosed over on landing. Now I was really hitting her. Men, ladders, chunks of metal were flying all over the place. Something like a miniature explosion blew up when the cone of my gun pattern hit her. There were flashes from ricocheting Tracer around me as I pulled over the aircraft and dropped down again, to flat hat out to sea. They had been so engrossed with Johnny's attack that I doubt if they knew I was there until it was all over. We had been patrolling over the fleet at 25,000 feet for 2.5 hours. Life was becoming a bit tedious, and our rear ends were beginning to notice what uncomfortable cushions parachutes provide. We were looking forward to landing on in half an hour at 12:30. At 12:15, our FDO came on the air to ask my petrol state. I told him I was okay, obviously much too cheerfully, for he promptly asked me to make it 13:30, there's a good chap, and rang off before I could argue. It was painfully obvious that the relieving flight was not yet ready to take off. We had a brand new number 4 in the flight, freshly arrived via the fleet train. He was just a boy. Now, over the wide watery wastes of the Northwest Pacific, his schoolboy voice piped up, "I say, Johnny." This to Baker, his number 3. "Yeah?" Baker didn't waste words. "What was that the CO said? 13:30? "Right." "Well, I was thinking, that's 1:30, isn't it?" "Right." "Well, what do we do for dinner?" Before anyone could give him a suitable reply, and the suitability would have been open to a lot of doubt, an American beat us all to the draw. From somewhere in the Okinawa area, anything up to 50 miles to the north, came a cheerful Bronx voice. "They send your goddamn dinner up to you. What else?" In all the RT chatter that filtered through the headset every day, it was, I suppose, only natural that one should perk up a little when friends' voices were recognized, particularly when they came from other carriers. A voice from nowhere, apparently young and naive, came up on the RT asking something which I would have thought to be self-evident and quite elementary. Our good friend Gammy Godson, CO of one of Indomitable's Hellcat squadrons, appeared to be in agreement, for it was his voice which promptly told the youngster not to be such a bloody fool. Always good advice. A few days later we returned to the carrier on a dark, stormy evening, with plenty of pitch to the ship's stern and great frothy bow waves breaking down her side. The voice of Indomitable's FDO came up, ordering her waiting flights to switch on navigation lights to assist the batsman. "Wilco, out," came the reply from the senior flight commander, and I was delighted to recognize the voice of my old friend Sammy Langdon. I was still thinking about him and of our good times together at St. Merin and in Egypt when one of his flights spoke to him. Funny how the youngsters could always be relied upon to provide the light relief, and this lad was no exception. "I say, Sammy." "Yes, what is it?" "Which is the switch for the navigation lights?" Like us, the majority of the Hellcat boys were not night flyers, and apart from those switches which we used daily, the vast expanse of the electrical switchboard down on the right-hand side of the cockpit was unknown territory to us. Sammy was a gentle, quiet creature with a voice which never rose above a subdued conversational tone. "Buggered if I know, old son. Do what I've done. Put the lot on and fuck the expense." I looked towards Indom. Sammy's aircraft, just turning in to the round down, looked like a Christmas tree. Wingtip lights, formation lights, navigation lights, landing searchlights, all were blazing in magnificent illumination. He never changed. A few days later, both he and Gammy Goodson were shot down. Two great pilots, two good friends. I had heard their voices for the last time. It was inevitable that we should become the target for a kamikaze attack, and April 6 was the day. I had sneaked into my cabin to freshen up after a hot, sticky day when everything happened. The 4.5-inch battery above me opened up, and as usual, everything took off. Books, shoes, glasses, photo frames, all showered down to the deck of my cabin in a hell of a mess. Something was really happening. I galloped down the passage to the nearest ladder, which I reached just before the Bofors started to crackle, and I was halfway up to the flight deck when the whole ship jumped 3 feet in the water. Torpedoed. It wasn't a torpedo, it was a kamikaze, and the Jap who had expired in the last few seconds had come out of a cloud on the port beam in a fast, shallow dive. One of our Bofors gunners hit him with his first shell and continued to hit him all the way down. Seconds before the Zeke reached us, the whole tail assembly parted company, and, having lost his rudder, the Jap slid off course. Instead of crashing into the angle of the island and the flight deck, which had been his intention, he hit the front of the compass platform with the starboard wing, and the plane, bomb and all, crashed into the sea 30 yards from the ship, where the whole lot blew up. The wind was from the starboard side, and we were immediately inundated with a shower of crankshafts, pistons, sections of fuselage and assorted pieces of Mitsubishi manufacture. The pilot's dinghy, a gaudy red and yellow affair, flew lazily across the deck, inflating itself in transit, and fetched up on the port aerial mast. The pilot's own skull was the first object to land on the deck, to be gathered up quickly by the medical profession. Perhaps the most macabre moment of the short action involved Bob Finley, our piano-playing captain's secretary, who at action stations was the captain of a multiple pom-pom on the port side. When the Jap appeared from the clouds, Bob was ready and full of zeal, his eye glued to the gun's rubber-eyed eyepiece and his hands ready on the twist-grip controls. When the aircraft lined up on the ship, Bob sighted through the ring sight further up the gun and let go, double forte and decidedly con brio. As the second kamikaze, for there were two of them, made his dive, Bob opened up again, but had to cease fire momentarily to flick away, somewhat petulantly, something which partially obscured the ring sight. He didn't feel very well 2 minutes later when he realized that what he had removed so peremptorily was a slender strip of Japanese flesh, about half a rasher. Things like that shouldn't happen to a captain's secretary. One act of cold-blooded courage must be recorded. When the kamikaze appeared, we had 2 Corsairs ranged on the centre line, all set for takeoff. Churchill was leading, Parley astern of him, both with engines turning and ready to go. Suddenly, the after 4.5-inch guns commenced to fire, simultaneously with a red warning over the tannoys. The 2 pilots bailed out, and together with mechanics who had been holding the chocks, ran to the island for cover. The steady shattering thump of the 4.5s, ear-splitting in the painful explosions from their muzzles, and the whip-like crack of the Beauforts and Ercolons on all sides, made incoherent all thought and speech. Parley, on leaving his aircraft, had found time to pull the mixture control back to automatic cut-off, which stopped the engine instantly. Churchill hadn't lingered, and the engine of his Corsair was still ticking over at about 300 revs. Now the engine's vibration, the tremor of the deck as the gunfire shook the ship, and finally the ship's leap into the air as the suicider exploded, all these proved sufficient to dislodge the aircraft's chocks, and the Corsair slowly moved forward and slightly to port. In a matter of seconds it would reach the port nets and plunge over them into the sea. £75,000, apart from any injuries it might cause on its way. There might be kamikazes about, although I couldn't see any as I emerged onto the flight deck. All I could see were shells exploding at a great height, and a strung-out flight of hellcats tearing upwards towards a bank of cumulus way above us. A tug on my sleeve brought me back to ground level. From the door to the island, where he had sought shelter, came Demain, our high-diving electrician, running swiftly towards the moving Corsair, completely disregarding kamikaze and gunfire. He leapt onto the wing and climbed into the cockpit, where he managed to hit the foot brakes in the nick of time, just as the wheels reached the 3-inch deck edge. He switched off the engine and sat there, cool as a cucumber, until 2 lads ran across with sets of chocks. I tried in vain to get a DSM for him, for his was a deed of true bravery in the middle of an action. He was, however, mentioned in dispatches, which showed at least that his courage had been recognized by the hierarchy. Finally, it should be recorded that only 7 seconds had elapsed between the kamikaze's first appearance through the overcast and his explosion in the water. It was, without a doubt, one of those occasions when seconds can stretch into eternity. Back to Hirari, as a change from Iriamoti and Ishigaki. On this particular afternoon we were on a 3-hour patrol, cruising in lazy circles over the island at 15,000 feet. We had searched the airfield. Nothing. By now they were pretty wise to us, and such aircraft as they were holding on the field were well hidden and out of harm's way. After 2 hours of this, one can become impatient and restless, and one looks for action. Action, for God's sake, before we go mad. The hell with this, lads. Let's go down and see what we can find. We plastered the brickwork of a Coast Guard station on the northernmost corner of the island, but there was no sign of activity. Probably it had become a favourite target for the learners, and the gentlemen of the Coast Guard service had decided that there were other and safer ways of spending an afternoon than sitting in a white box waiting to be shot at. I saw their point of view. That certainly didn't satisfy our lust. We beat up a small coaster, little more than a large fishing trawler, until I felt like a big bully and left them in peace to run into shallow water to beach what was left of her. We saw some Jap soldiers dash for shelter into a row of detached houses on the outskirts of the town. One run down the row was enough to bang some incendiaries into them. That was sufficient to make me feel a cheap little vandal, and I slunk away, taking my 3 lads with me. We weren't winning the war playing around like this. It must have been about 1630 as we crossed the town, flying at about 8,000 feet. Glory be, there was a parade ground. What was more, it was pretty full with all the licentious soldiery drawn up in serried ranks. One of the Corsair's drawbacks, as far as the enemy was concerned, was that the exhaust roar from its 18 cylinders was all behind it. There was virtually no noise from the engine apparent until the aircraft was almost overhead. It was said that the Japanese called it the Whispering Death, for this reason. So, when I decided to attack this juicy target, they broke formation only when it was too late for most of them to find cover. There were 3 possible angles from which to attack, only one of which was dangerous. After an afternoon of sheer frustration, monumental stupidity born of weariness, and a touch of twitch chose for me the route which in normal and more carefree times would clearly have indicated a sticky death this way. In my eagerness to get in amongst it without losing the invaluable element of surprise, I gave the boys no warning at all. I banged the stick over to the right and down, leaving them to follow as best they could. It was providential that I did so, for had I led them down in an orderly formation, at least 2 of them would have bought it. As it was, they had scarcely made their move to follow me down when they realized that I had made a hash of things, giving them time to alter their own approach to something much safer and more airman-like. Certainly I wrought a bit of death and destruction, there was no doubt about that. With that enhanced falcon-like vision which fiercely pumped adrenaline produces at moments of high excitement, I could see soldiers fairly bouncing away from the sledgehammer impact of the .5 shells. It needed only a touch on the rudder bar to cover square yards of the parade ground, and there was a fair number of bodies lying motionless as I levelled out and pulled away. And then I saw it. Rising sharply from the back of the military area was a sheer cliff-like eminence, which I had completely missed in my haste to get to ground level. Now, as I approached it at 300 knots, it looked like the north wall of the Eiger. Taking my life in my hands, I pulled on the stick for all I was worth. I can only remember thick streamers springing from my wingtips before I blacked out, good and true. The blackout hit me like pentothal. There was no greying out, no fuzziness. I went out like a light. When I recovered, I was out at sea, climbing gently at about 150 knots, safe and sound. The others had formed up on me again and were gazing at me with uncomprehending eyes. Well they might. They had all been enthralled by the spectacle of their senior and most stupid bastard of an officer busily trying to kill himself. I hope my guardian angel put in for overtime, for by God he had earned it. April 7 started off in great style. We were over Miyako in the early morning and had a field day with 2 aircraft destroyed and 1 damaged. Things were going well and the boys were on form. And then it just had to turn into one of those days. Percy Cole took his flight to Hirara in his own particular style. His method, a good one too, was to approach the island from the west, fly through the town at Chimney Pot height, then drop down onto the airfield like the wrath of God. He told me later that as he was leaving the town and approaching the airfield boundary, short-range flak flashed from the gun emplacements on the field, prompting him to look across and up to Marriott. He was flying 40 feet above the rest of them, and Percy screamed at him to get his head down. But young Marriott never heard him. As Percy pressed the RT button on his throttle lever, he saw a shell blast through the windshield of the luckless Marriott's aircraft. The plane rolled onto its back and tore into the ground at 300 knots or more. On the previous evening, I had finished the flying orders for the following day and wandered along to the wardroom. There was time for a couple of drinks before going to bed. Winnie Churchill was the first man I bumped into. "Winnie, just the man I was looking for. I've put you on to Ishigaki for the first shift, okay?" "Yes, sure, boss. My own boys?" "Yes, as usual." I paused for a moment. "Now, remember, no fooling." He gave me an old-fashioned look. "You know those bastards on Ishigaki as well as I do. Unless you damn well have to, no more than 2 runs. Now his look said, without a shadow of doubt, "Windy bastard." I ignored it and pressed on. "Look, don't be a bloody fool. You know they have the measure of you after 2 runs down that strip. I don't want those kids of yours to be killed because you want to be a hero. I just want new kids to be given a break." Johnny Lauder, his number 3, was a good, solid, experienced hand. It was the other 2 I feared for. So, on April 7, Winnie went to Ishigaki. They came back with one of Mike's flights, and I was standing with wings on his bridge when they came down to the carrier. But there weren't 8, only 7. The 1830 boys came on first. Good, clever landings. The wires screaming out as they were arrested, and the barriers clanging as they taxied up the deck in the old, efficient rhythm. There were 4 of them, so it was my flight that was one short. The 3 of them came on. Again, good, safe landings. The oxygen masks hid their faces, but certainly Winnie wasn't there. I would have known him. Johnny Lauder jumped from his cockpit at the front end and came running down the deck. He bounded up the ladder and joined me. He had a stammer which excitement and emotion were now exaggerating. It's Winnie, Hans. I'm awfully sorry. It's Winnie. He's gone." There were tears in his eyes, running down in channels through the grime left by his goggles. They had made a couple of runs up the airstrip, smacking 1 or 2 aircraft parked on one side. They then flew up and away, their job done. After a minute or so, Winnie tapped his headphones, the top of his helmet, and pointed to Lauder. This signified, "My radio is unserviceable. I am handing the lead over to you." Winnie wheeled out of formation and dived back to Ishigaki, Johnny turned the flight so that he could keep him in sight. Lauder said he saw him tearing in from the west. He had no idea why he had gone back. They had seen nothing which called for another attack. But maybe Winnie had. He reached the eastern end of the runway and of the island itself when his aircraft seemed to falter. Then it turned over very, very slowly and slid into the sea. My immediate reaction was to be furiously angry. Why the hell did he have to be the clever bastard and refuse to listen? Why the hell did he think he was invulnerable where so many other pilots had fallen? But I couldn't be angry any more when I saw Jack Parley's face. They had been inseparable buddies since they had joined up together in New Zealand, and Jack's face showed what it was going to mean to him to have to fight the rest of the war without his cobber. Churchill was as brave as a lion. He loved living and he loved fighting. Although I am convinced there was not the slightest need for him to return to that death trap, I know, too, that one can rarely change human nature. If I could have brought him back to life that instant, given him a Corsair and told him to go back and belt the hell out of Ishigaki, he wouldn't have hesitated. He wouldn't have had it any other way. On April 11, the staff decided that we should attack the kamikazes on their home ground, and strikes at Formosa were laid on. The weather intervened, however, and the operation was delayed for 24 hours. The following morning we provided a strong escort of Corsairs for the Avengers as they made their way to Shinchiku Airfield on the northwestern corner of the island. As we flew along the north coast, 7 or 8 miles from land, Jake Millard came up on the radio to report that his aircraft was failing quickly. Jake of 1830 Squadron was a great fellow, both in stature and in spirit. Prior to the war, he had been on the Metropolitan Police Force and was renowned as a swimmer and a water polo player. He was also a reliable pilot with a truly remarkable accident-free record. I looked around to find him already losing speed and height through reduced power. We talked briefly, and I realized that he had no alternative but to ditch. I looked at the coast, my watch, and the compass, and hoped I might be able to give something like a reasoned suggestion of his position. Then I told Baker to go down and see how Jake fared when he hit the drink. Johnny watched him glide into a moderate sea as I pumped out a mayday signal. Johnny then saw him start to swim towards the shore, and we shall never know why he hadn't rescued his dinghy from the sinking aircraft. By this time the strike was well down the coast, so Johnny climbed back to a fair altitude to transmit another mayday signal, confident that the air-sea rescue services in the area would pick him up. He then descended again, this time to sea level, but he was unable to find Jake again. As I have said earlier, it is extremely difficult to spot a man's head in the Northwest Pacific. By now we had reached Shinchiku. Cloud level was down to about 2,500 feet, and visibility inland was poor. The Avengers went in to bomb the airfield and adjacent roads and railway lines. We did a quick pass round the airfield. There was little opposition and nothing to hit. We made another circuit of the field. This time the short-range flak burst into life with a vengeance, fierce and persistently accurate. Eventually we rejoined the Avengers off the coast, feeling as though we had come on a wild goose chase. We had been back in the ship for only a short time when there was a flurry of excitement. We were summoned at the double to see wings. "Panic on, chaps. Maximum effort required. Get every damn thing that will fly refueled and rearmed. The Admiral's calling for an all-out effort." Mike was the first to speak. What's the target, sir? Shinchiku again. Get them cracking. I looked at Michael, then back to Wings. But there's damn all there, sir. Hell, we've only just come back. It's like Easter Sunday. Hans, for God's sake, don't argue. Get on with it. The Admiral says there's more than 300 aircraft there. Mike looked as bewildered as I felt. He tried again. So far as I'm concerned, there are 300 bomb craters there and nothing else. The Admiral has to be talking about somewhere else. By this time, the discussion group, it was now War by Committee, had moved from the flying bridge to the compass platform. Now the captain joined in. You're sure about this? We nodded. You're sure you've been to Shinchiku? Nods of assent, again, unanimous and vigorous. And you say there's nothing there? Absolutely nothing, sir. Right. Leave it to me for 5 minutes, and don't pull out any stops until I say so. Within a few minutes he recalled us. The flap's off. It seems that a pilot from another carrier reported that there were 3 or 4 aircraft. Some I.O. has apparently written down 304 and has reported it to the staff as such. He waited for explosions. None came. For once we were tongue-tied. So the Admiral has called off the strike. He grinned at Ian Sorrell. As we walked down the flight deck, Mike said in his unemotional way, Now how the hell does anyone with any sense at all get around to accepting as gospel a figure like 304? Jerry Connolly, a Southern Irishman whose famous uncle had been shot as a rebel by the British during the Easter Rising of 1916, and who accepted Englishmen with an easy-going tolerance, snorted and allowed a derisory grin to spread over his face. They must have worked it out that the pilot, whoever he was, counted 912 aircraft wheels and divided it by 3. That's the English way, isn't it? Jake Millard never made it. The Mayday signals we had transmitted whistled up an American Martin Mariner flying boat, expert at its job of air-sea rescue. But although they searched the area assiduously for hours, they had no luck. Jake had gone forever. 16. Finished with engines. And then, like so many times over the past years, it was all over. For Illustrious, April 13 was the last day of Operation Iceberg, and after spending 2 days in the replenishment area with the fleet train, we sailed for the Philippines. Our anchoring in Leyte Gulf and the anticipation of the usual traffic between ships was clouded with sadness for me. Johnny Baker's brother, Sam, was an Avenger pilot in Indomitable. In recent weeks, we had seen him pull off a classic ditching alongside a destroyer when his undercarriage failed to extend. It was done so magnificently, in a nasty short sea with a vicious chop, that Sam and his 2 crewmen had been rescued without difficulty. In fact, I doubt even if Sam got his hair wet. So now Johnny took a boat across to the Indomitable to see how Sam had fared in the Sakashima battles. He was frozen to the spot when her officer of the watch informed him on arrival at the gangway that his brother had been killed up in the islands. I felt deeply for John. He was, and still is, a fine chap, and in post-war years I was to be fortunate enough to become acquainted with all his family. To lose one's brother was bad enough, but to learn of it in such a manner was an even more bitter blow. I wondered then, as I do now, at the callousness of Sam's friends and senior officers who so lamentably found this to be their way of breaking such news. It could easily have been done more delicately. A private signal to Illustrious would have enabled Captain Lamb to tell Johnny the bad tidings in his own very special way, with infinite kindness and sympathy. There was, however, a more pleasant surprise awaiting us. There, across the great harbour, looking very smart and warlike, lay Formidable, third ship of our class, freshly arrived from the UK. She looked good, and her corsairs on deck brooded, as always, like menacing harbingers of death. Mike Tritton was an old friend of Judy Garland, one of her Corsair's COs. With bitter memories of the toll that Sakashima Gunto had taken on our boys, he went across to Formid to put Judy wise as to what constituted life and death up in the islands. He would do it well, too, for there is nothing pedantic about him, quiet, reserved, pleasant, and no fighter boy nonsense. But Judy was in no mood to listen. "Cut the shop, old boy. Get this drink down you," Mike would have liked to say. "No Hendon air display tricks. Sneak up on them and hit them first time, for there won't be a second chance. Be a dirty fighter." No one wanted to listen, but then who does? We all know very well how to do it and need no lectures. We all insist on learning it the hard way. When they went to Sakashima, Judy was killed on the first day, diving down to do a strafing run. But we didn't go back. Formidable had 3 propellers, a fresh crew, and a new on-the-ball air group. We had only 2 propellers and a crew and air group who were now very weary and firing on only 3 cylinders. Our time to depart had come. Some of the young men who had joined us as replacements only during the last 2 or 3 months were transferred to other carriers to work out their stint. Johnny Lauder, Don Cameron, Sid Newton, young Hartshorn, Johnny Maybank. We sat in Leyte Gulf for a day or 2, refueled and took on supplies. Then one fine day we left the Philippines forever. Illustrious was going home. As we passed through the Bismarck Sea en route for Sydney, we heard the wonderful news that the war in Europe had ended. VE Day. About 1800 we told our attendant destroyers to sheer off out of range, then gave the Bismarck Sea a feu de joie with everything we possessed, from 4.5-inch guns to Very pistols. For 30 seconds there was one hell of a racket. The captain said a few words to the ship's company, most of whom were on the flight deck to watch the fireworks. He was followed by the chaplain, who asked us to join him in prayers. Then Captain Lamb came back to the microphone to announce, "Splice the main brace." We descended to the wardroom and, for the one and only time during the commission, had a glass of rum. Our voyage down the eastern coast of Australia passed remarkably quickly, and more farewells were in the offing. When we reached Sydney, we would be parting with pilots who were heading directly for home instead of the United Kingdom. Johnny Baker and Mo Pawson to Canada, Mick Ritchie, Matt Barber, Jimmy Clark and Pop Quigg to New Zealand. We would be leaving Jimmy James in Sydney to give the doctors a chance to heal his broken arm. He wouldn't get very far with the nurses unless they were agile and extremely cooperative, for our docs had constructed one of those preposterous girder jobs on which the offending limb reposed at a great height. As we approached Sydney Heads, we flew our Corsairs off to Bankstown, and that was the last we saw of them. Strangely enough, I felt no twinge. I can only suppose I assumed, without question, that in a matter of months we would be back at Bankstown to pick up new ones. We flitted round Sydney like a cloud of moths with no home to go to. Probably because we were tired, there was no great burning up of the town. There was an air of anticlimax mixed with a certain amount of relief. Certainly there was no hilarious rejoicing at our release from the chores and the daily hazards of Sakashima Gunto. Japan still had to be broken, and if their defense of Iwo Jima, Saipan, Okinawa, yes, and Sakashima was any criterion, to beat them on their home ground would be hell let loose. In our secret hearts, we knew we would be back again. But all that was in the future. It would be a long time before we sailed again through Sydney Heads, so we lived for the day and wondered, in the vaguest possible way, what tomorrow or next year would bring. At last we sailed, and it seemed strange to be passengers. The hangar was a great echoing emptiness. The barriers and arrestor wires had been unshipped. There wasn't an aircraft in sight, and from Sydney Heads we saw not a ship until we sailed into Aden to refuel. We stopped for 24 hours in Port Said, where Ian Sarrell and I spent an hour or two at the officers' club. At midnight we strolled down to the quay to look for a boat to take us out to the carrier, anchored in the stream nearly half a mile away. There was a small rowing boat tied up with a couple of the usual unsavoury characters aboard. "You want boat, Captain!" shouted one of them. We walked over to the steps and told them where we wanted to go. We were in a mellow, generous mood and didn't argue too vehemently about the fare. The oarsmen bent to their task as we settled ourselves in the stern sheets. Somewhere about halfway they stopped and rested on their oars. "Come on, Igri, Igri!" I shouted, using one of my 2 words of Arabic. "More money, Captain! We want more money!" This is it, I thought. It's the old taxi racket all over again, but this time surrounded by water. I looked around for a weapon and was relieved to see that the tiller could be unshipped, but there was nothing for Ian. Strangely enough, for a man with no experience at all of the wiles of the Egyptians, he looked remarkably calm. He was still very composed when he produced a .38 revolver from his trouser waistband. "Just carry on rowing and no funny business," with a menacing wave of that thing in his right hand. Needless to say, we reached Illustrious in record time. The port side of those days abounded in touts of every description, probably exceeded only by those of Cairo. Hawkers roamed the streets with anything from hair combs to filthy pictures, and small boys of unbelievable precocity touted for the girls, usually, "My sister, you come see my sister. Pink inside, just like white girl." The story was told of a ship's captain who, landing at one of the quays and striding purposefully for the administrative offices, was waylaid in such a manner by a scruffy little urchin. "Run away, little boy," said the captain testily. "It's the harbour master I want." "Okay, Captain," was the unabashed retort. "Okay, come, please, can arrange." Some of our young men had learnt a little about it even in 12 short hours. When Ian and I went down to the wardroom, we were lucky enough to find that some kind souls had kept a couple of drinks for us, for the bar had now been closed for more than an hour. A few of the subbies were saying hard things about the local inhabitants, for despite warnings from old desert types, they had nevertheless fallen for one of the oldest tricks under the pyramids. "You want dirty pictures, Captain," was the opening gambit, with a quick flourish of a photograph, postcard size, of an Edwardian gentleman clad in black socks, sporting a large handlebar moustache, on the point of bestriding a buxom, middle-aged old sport in black stockings and fancy garters. Packet of 12, Captain. Very dirty, very exciting. Only 50 piastres. The boys fell for it like a gluttonous salmon going for a fly. While the high-pressure salesman was running like a hare down some unmentionable side street, our young men were avidly inspecting their purchase. One nauseating shot of grotesque copulation, 10 rather pleasant views of Cairo Mosque, the pyramids, and the de Lesseps statue, and a dreadful portrait of the even more dreadful King Farouk. After leaving Port Said, we organized evening concerts on the flight deck, even at the risk of damaging our precious piano by bringing it up on the after lift. We had endless deck hockey tournaments. The highlight for most of us was a reversion to peacetime routine, when at 1200 every day it was hands to bathe. The ship hove to, and for half an hour anything up to 1,000 men cavorted in the blue water, miles from land. Gibraltar, and another 24 hours stop. We took on board the entire crew of a U-boat which had recently sailed in to surrender. The captain was a nasty, flaxen-haired Teuton, full to the eyebrows of National Socialism, who, contrary to the attitude of his more reasonably minded officers, appeared to possess a desire to continue the war on a private basis. He had to be strictly isolated from them. When he proved to be thoroughly intransigent, he was confined permanently to his cabin. We applauded to a man the orders of the commander to the marine sentry posted at his door with rifle and fixed bayonet, that he should not hesitate to run through this Nazi should he attempt to leave his cabin. I spent quite a lot of time hanging around that particular flat in the fervent hope that the Marine would be given his chance. The U-boat's crew were a fine bunch of lads who readily joined our own ship's company in the task of chipping paintwork in readiness for the forthcoming refit. The gusto and thoroughness with which they went about their work should have told us that Germany wouldn't be too long in recovering from the destruction of their country. At 18 knots we plugged through the Bay of Biscay and were now within reach of home. The minefields down the east coast of Britain were still to be cleared, and, at the height of a lovely summer, we cruised at a leisurely 13 or 14 knots through the Western Isles, and admiring the magnificent scenery as it was unfolded before us. What awaited us when we reached port? I don't suppose many of us gave it a thought. So far as we knew, Illustrious would undergo a pretty thorough refit. We would probably find ourselves in some less exacting jobs for a spell, and then back to the Pacific without a doubt, for the subjugation of Japan itself promised to be another 30 years' war. The destruction of Hiroshima, however, to astound the world within a few short weeks, would resolve all our problems. It would also pose a bagful of new ones. So we turned the corner and cruised southwards to Rosyth, happy and contented in our serene, blissful ignorance. We didn't know that never again would we have to face the fearful flak over Ishigaki. Never again would our heads spin round at the cry of, "Rats, 3 o'clock up!" No more would the Corsairs screech to a stop as they pulled out the screaming arrestor wires. The Basha huts of Trincomalee, the crocodiles in the estuary, the incredible green of the Sumatran jungle, and the wide, limitless expanse of the great oceans, we had seen them all for the last time. Our war was over, and we didn't know it. And what of our fine squadrons? The Canadians and most of the New Zealanders had already gone home. Those of us who were still in the ship would be scattered to the four winds as soon as we reached port. Only a handful of us would ever meet again. Joe Vickers, Bud Sutton, Winnie Churchill, and a host of others were dead. We had left them in America, in Sumatra, in Ceylon, and in the great wastes of the oceans. When the tumult and the shouting had died, we would remember them, for the ties of the branch are strong, and the comradeship, the courage, the fun, the heroism, and the heartache of the war would never be forgotten by those of us who lived. And then, at last, the saga was over. We steamed up the Forth, the first ship to return from the Pacific War. Every vessel in the estuary manned ship in our honour, and their cheers floated down to us in turn as we passed them. There is something akin to a lump in my throat, even after all these years, as I hear the distant bugles sounding the still, as our great old lady swept majestically up to the dockyard. She was my ship, the only ship to which I had truly belonged. My pride in her was still unabated. Her magic name has ever since been a part of my life.